Dan Clark Audio tend to have a pretty scientific approach to the production of their headphones. And it doesn't always result, in my experience at least, in the best possible sound from an enjoyment point of view. With the new E3 closed-back headphones, Dan Clark Audio have brought out a couple of new versions of their own proprietary technologies, and that might make the E3 DCA's most technically advanced headphone as of yet. But the question for me was whether or not that translated into a better listening experience. So let's find out. The E3s here come in at $2,000 and, as I've already said, are a closed-back headphone. They're also a planar magnetic headphone, and they come with specifications of a 27 ohm impedance and about a 90 decibel per milliwatt sensitivity. And that makes them a little bit difficult to drive, but they're not too bad. As I already mentioned, there's some brand new technology, or at least some evolutions of technology from Dan Clark Audio in here, and those include a new version of the V-planar technology, which is essentially a driver that's got folds or ridges built into it or pressed into it, compressed into it, as well as the 5th generation of their AMTS system, which is an insert that sits between your ear and the driver and filters out unwanted resonance, directs the frequencies and the sound waves towards your ear in apparently the most optimal way, and has done some great things in the past for the Expanse and the Stealth. I haven't tried the electrostatic, so I can't comment on that one, but I think it's generally considered to be an excellent technology, and therefore having a new version done a little bit differently in the E3 was an interesting thing to check out. I'll come back around at the end of this review and talk a little bit more about the design, the comfort, some of the technologies within the E3, but I want to jump now straight into sound quality. And the first thing I'd say about the E3 is they deliver a wonderful sense of resolution and detail for a $2,000 closed-back headphone. Stepping through the frequency range, the bass from the E3 is one that delivers excellent low, sub-bass type presence and impact, but not so much through the mid-bass where they are a little bit lean and a little bit pulled back there. That's part of how they're able to give that wonderful sense of detail and resolution because there's no bass sort of getting in the way of that. They deliver vocals and mid-range that's textured and detail, but I'd say mostly in the upper registers of the mid-range. So for things like female vocals and say an alto saxophone or the upper registers of a tenor saxophone, these are absolutely brilliant. As you come a bit lower in the range though, I'd say that the mid-range is a little bit thinner, a little bit lighter than I personally enjoy it, but still excellent in terms of technical capabilities. Imaging accuracy and separation of sounds is fantastic, and I'd say that the stage depth and layering is somewhat limited, but definitely better than most closed-back headphones in my experience. The overall result of all of this is a headphone that I think is tonally generally very good. I think they come across generally as a neutral sounding headphone, but I do also find that there's a little bit of upper mid-range emphasis that throws the tonality off just a little bit sometimes, and for me, depending on the source I connect it up to, can be just a touch fatiguing occasionally when I hit the wrong recording on the wrong source chain. For the most part though, they're very, very enjoyable. And so straight off the bat, I find the DCA E3 to be a very impressive closed-back headphone, one of the very best closed-back headphones that I've tried from a sonic point of view. They don't emotionally engage me as much as some other headphones I've tried, but it could be because they're actually a little bit more neutral and a little bit less coloured, and I know that some people really value that in a headphone, and so I'm going to tell you as much as I can about the sound of these and let you decide if it's right for you, even though they're not the perfect fit for me from a tonal perspective. Technically, it's undeniable just how good these are. Before I get into some further comparisons with the Lyric 2 from Meze Audio to help clarify exactly what I think of the E3s, before I get there, I do want to quickly mention the isolation on these, and that's to say that they are absolutely excellent. In the recently released Meze Audio Liric 2 review, I talked about how great they are at isolating, that they're almost up there with active noise cancelling headphones, at least for normal background noise, maybe not so much for airplane travel, train travel, etc. And I think the E3s are just as good. I perhaps get a slight sense of more separation or isolation from the world on the Lyric 2, but I don't know if there's actually, from a measurable point of view, if they're actually isolating more, or if it's just the way they kind of sound is a funny word because it's the silence that I'm talking about. The way they don't sound in the case of the Lyric 2 compared to the E3 makes me think that maybe they're isolating just a tiny, tiny bit more, but I'm not certain about that. And so now that I've started talking about the Lyric 2, it is worth mentioning, if you haven't seen my review of the Lyric 2, in that video I did extensive comparisons between the E3 and the Lyric 2, but at the end of that video I still wasn't sure that I could give enough of a sense of how both of these two performed to help everybody make up their own mind. It was clear to me at that point that I prefer the Lyric 2. It's an emotionally more engaging headphone for me, but I can absolutely see a whole lot of people loving this headphone far more than Lyric 2 because of its more neutral and potentially more technically capable sounding presentation. And so with that in mind, I'm going to do more comparisons here now between the Lyric 2 and the Dan Clark Audio E3 to hopefully help you further refine your decision-making process. Or if you're only watching this review, to work out if the E3 is the correct headphone for you, or if you need to go over and watch the Lyric 2 video, maybe look at some other reviews and see which one is actually the correct choice for you. Before I get into talking about the sound of these, it's worth mentioning my source chain for all this testing. I've used the E3s across a whole bunch of different devices, but the testing and comparisons I did with the Meze Audio Liric 2 was all using my PC with a high-quality JCAT USB card, feeding out through a tubuless Consensus USB cable into the Chord M scaler through a pair of Analysis Plus Silver Apex BNC cables to the Chord Dave, and then from the Chord Dave through a pair of Curious XLRs and into the Burson Audio Voyager headphone amp. With that setup, one of the first tracks I listened to was Differently by Marion Hill. I talked about that track in my recent video about the top electronic genre albums for audiophiles. This is a really fantastic album, definitely worth checking out. And starting off with the E3s, listening to Differently by Marion Hill, the first thing I noticed was the impact and presence that the deep bass notes have from the E3. These are a very capable driver in terms of delivering bass impact, bass energy, and really well controlled textured bass. When the vocal comes in, it's crisp and it's clean, really nicely delivered. I think female vocals from the E3 are fantastic in general. And there are some chimes or similar type of instrument that rings out from the left-hand side on this track that just pop out of nowhere with this wonderful sense of space around them. There's also a regular percussive sound throughout this track that sounds a little bit like a woodblock being hit, but the E3s deliver enough nuance and detail in the sound that as I listened more, it became evident that I'm pretty sure it's actually a sample. And I think some lesser quality closed-back headphones would completely muffle that nuance and you wouldn't get the sense that it's actually a sample, it would just sound like a woodblock. But it's the tail end of the notes have a certain character or texture to them, it clips off a little bit faster than you'd expect, and that's all stuff that the E3 can reveal to you and let you really properly understand the sound. Speaking about individual sounds, the E3 separates sounds very nicely, but I think the overall soundstage is more wide than it is deep. It's a slightly sort of stretched out, squashed oval sort of sound. And that's probably one area that I feel they do fall just a little bit short, is they don't give me as much layering and depth in the soundstage as I would like. So all instruments and sounds are wonderfully separated. They're wonderfully focused in space. You can hear where each individual sound is. There's no congestion, there's no overlap, but it's all a little bit more left and right than it is deep. And that's something I do enjoy, is a bit of depth in the soundstage. These don't quite do that for me. If we then think about the Lyric 2, listening to exactly the same track, and on the Lyric 2, it's quite a different presentation. The bass still hits hard, but it's a little bit fuller from the Lyric 2. It's more complete, it's got that mid-bass and that deep bass emphasis. On the other hand, that chime that I spoke about before in the left-hand channel, that doesn't ring out quite as obviously and quite as cleanly from the Lyric 2. It's not muffled or lost, but where it was really prominent and evident from the E3, it's kind of more in the mix with everything with the Lyric 2. The vocal is once again crisp and clean from the Lyric 2, and I feel like there's a little bit of extra emphasis in some of the upper end kind of breath type sounds from the Lyric 2, which does have a bit of treble emphasis, as I spoke about in my review of them. But then as we think about the lower registers of the vocals, there's a bit more presence and smoothness to the voice that the Lyric 2 delivers, and it's preferable to me. I feel like you're getting more of the chest resonance that goes with a voice, not just the head and throat resonance. I also feel like the additional mid-bass energy from the Lyric 2 somehow produces a greater sense of contrast between the vocal and the bass. Probably because I think with the Lyric 2 on this particular track, the vocal is at this level and the bass is at this level. They're both clearly separated, they're not getting in the way of each other, but because they're at a similar level, you get to hear the contrast between the upper frequencies and the lower frequencies. Whereas on the E3, the vocal is at this level and the bass is more at this level. And so you don't get that interplay as much between the frequencies. It's just vocal with bass secondary. Now, some people are going to prefer that sound. I personally prefer the Lyric 2 presentation, but that's going to be something that you have to work out how you like to hear your music. Overall, I find that the Lyric 2 has consistently better bass presence and energy and feel throughout this track. And the nice thing is that it never muddies anything up. So whilst on one hand you might think that the E3 has been tuned as it has to prevent muddying of the mid-range, and indeed that might be why it has been tuned this way, my experience with the Lyric 2 is that you can still have your bass without muddying up the mid-range. And so it's going to come down to a question of which style of sound you like, not so much which one's actually better, because neither is getting in the way of the mid-range. One of them in the E3 is more mid-range focused because it doesn't have that mid-bass, but it's not to say that you lose mid-range focus by having the mid-bass in the Lyric 2. It just puts everything level and keeps everything performing really well. Ultimately, I think both presentations are fantastic. If I could only have one of these headphones, I would be completely happy with either. But for me and my taste and preferences, the Lyric 2 is just a little bit more fun on a track like this one. If we then move over to a different track, and now we're onto Old Pine by Ben Howard, starting off with the Lyric 2, and the opening guitar sounds mostly good, but a little bit unnatural on the more, what I would call the more energetic notes from the guitar. So when there's a more kind of a deliberate or a harder pluck of the string to emphasize the note, the upper treble emphasis from the Lyric 2 just makes that sound a little bit unnatural in this recording. This recording has some interesting processing going on as well, and that possibly doesn't help matters, but the Lyric 2 does sound a touch off on these particular guitar notes. As a part of that processing in this track, the vocal has been overdubbed or something, and it just has a slightly constantly unnatural tonality to it. It's also quite close to the listener, so it's kind of hard to judge on this track exactly what's correct and incorrect. But it does mean that it doesn't sound particularly natural from the Lyric 2, nor does it from the E3. Having said that, not all of our music's going to be perfectly mixed, so I didn't want to throw it out and continued using it as a comparison and a reference point because it's interesting to see what a headphone does with less than ideal music. As the track continued, I noticed that the Lyric 2 slightly overemphasized some of the breath sounds in the vocals, particularly from the backing vocalists in this track. And likewise, there's a tambourine being played that's very crisp and clean, but probably a touch over-enhanced once again. At the other end of the scale, though, there's a kick bass that sounds absolutely fantastic from the Lyric 2. It's present, it's solid, it's punchy, but not overdone. It doesn't take over the track at all. And the strings in the backing of this track also sound very natural, very clean, and very true to life. And so generally speaking, despite this track having some interesting production, generally speaking, the Lyric 2 does a good job at producing a natural and enjoyable sound. There's just a few areas that it over-enhances things, particularly on those exaggerated or emphasized guitar notes. So it's not a perfect rendition, but it's not too bad. As we move over to the E3 then, the upper registers of that guitar are now much more natural, but on the other hand, the upper mid-range of it, so moving from the upper treble emphasis down now to the upper mid-range emphasis, now it's the E3 that has problems in the upper mid-range of the sound. And so I think with the E3, I would say that all of the guitar notes sound just a little bit too emphasized in the upper mids. It makes the tonality of the guitar sound to my ears a little bit off. Whereas at least on the Lyric 2, the distraction of the unnatural sound was only in the upper registers. It wasn't every single note. And so the E3 has its own problems. I don't think either headphone really nails it on this track. I also found that the staging on this track, which was already relatively shallow, got a bit shallower still on the E3. It's a much more lateral presentation on the E3. There's at least a little bit of depth on the Lyric 2. And so again, I don't think either headphone's really excelling on this track, but the Lyric 2 is doing a little better in this space. Thinking about the vocals specifically, the E3 emphasizes the upper mid-range fairly obviously on a track like this one, and in comparison to the Lyric 2, but I think it makes the vocals a little bit more preferable, a little bit more enjoyable compared to the Lyric 2 on this track. And this is where it gets difficult between these headphones. From one track to the next, sometimes I preferred the E3, sometimes I preferred the Lyric 2 if I was thinking about their tonality. I think both have slightly coloured tonalities. It's just a question of which one gets it closer to correct for you and your ears. The E3 for me was just as good as the Lyric 2 in terms of texture and detail and clarity through the vocals and the backing vocals. Again, they emphasise things slightly differently, but both were very enjoyable in that regard. But where there was emphasis in the upper registers for things like the tambourine in this track from the Lyric 2, now with the different emphasis from the E3, the emphasis goes to places like the snare. And so again, each have their colorations. It's going to depend on what you like and don't like. And I know for me that upper mid-range emphasis isn't something I tend to enjoy. I'd much rather a little bit of a treble lift than an upper mid-range lift, and that's where the Lyric 2 does tend to drag me back to enjoying it just a little bit more. But that's just my preference. It's not saying it's better. One area that I do think the E3 struggles a touch on this track is the kick bass. I talked about how good that sounded from the Lyric 2. It doesn't sound quite right to me from the E3. It's lacking the presence and the punch and the weight that I think it should. And again, that's because of the tuning of the E3, having the raised sub bass, but then the dip down into the mid bass. And it just throws off the tonality of anything below about probably 300 hertz or so. Anything that's focused in that 300 to 100 hertz range, maybe even a little bit below down to say 80 hertz, they just don't have the presence and weight and body that I think it needs to have from a naturality point of view. Having said all that, I think overall on this particular track, the E3 actually handles it better. It's not a great track in terms of production. I think it trips up both of these headphones because the production's already a little bit wonky. It kind of brings out more of the imbalances, the tonal issues that these headphones have, as all headphones do. And I think the E3 does handle it better across the board. And so as you can see, both headphones are excellent, but both headphones have challenges, and it's where it becomes very difficult to say which one's the better choice. And it's also where I think you probably can't go wrong here. I don't imagine anyone buying either of these is going to hate them. The question comes down to which particular sound profile you're going to enjoy more. And let me give you one more track example to help illustrate that. I'm not going to go into as much depth and detail, but this was a real turning point for me, this next track. And the track I'm talking about is Knock Yourself Out by Tower of Power. It's a live recording. It's a great piece of music with lots of solos. It's a really funky track. And starting off on the E3 puts a lot of emphasis into the saxophone work. It's a very focused, detailed sound from the sax, but it also, to my ears, sounds a little tiny bit honky because of the upper mid-range emphasis. Something else that I noticed as I listened to this, and I've heard this track across so many systems, is that it's a track that should really groove. It should have you tapping your foot, bobbing your head, and I never quite got that feel from the E3. And the particular reason for that is that the rhythm section just doesn't have the weight and the presence to drive this track along in the way that I believe it should. And again, I think that just comes back to the mid-bass tuning. If they just had that little bit more mid-bass energy and authority, it would lift the emotional engagement that the E3 delivers, at least to me it would, and that would connect me more to the music and have me really engaged with the rhythm and the soul of a track like this. On the other hand, going to Lyric 2, the timbre is still a little bit off in my opinion on the saxophone, but the overall balance of the sound, if I think about it from bass through to treble, the overall balance of the sound is better, and therefore I'm not as drawn to focusing on the issues with the saxophone because I'm able to just engage with the whole musical experience. There's a very short drum solo at the 13-minute 40 mark or thereabouts on this track, and listening to it on both of these headphones, the Lyric 2 has the right sense of weight and energy from the bass and the lower toms, whereas from the E3 it's all snares and cymbals and maybe the upper toms, but you don't get the full scale and energy of the drum kit in the same way from the E3 that I found myself getting from the Lyric 2. Likewise, there's an organ solo that follows on from the drum solo, and that plays some really deep organ notes that should rumble and really groove. Once again, the E3 kind of lacks a bit of energy and presence there, whereas the Lyric 2 drew me along for that ride. And so as you're probably gathering from this, the Lyric 2 is the headphone that I definitely prefer. I think it's the more emotionally engaging headphone. I think the E3 in some ways is the more technically focused headphone, not technically capable, but technically focused headphone. I think it's deliberately showing you the technicalities, emphasizing the technicalities, and some people are going to love that. For me, though, it does come at the expense of the emotional engagement with the music, and that's actually the thing that I think is most important. I do think these are the two best price-to-performance closed-back headphones on the market. I probably would choose the DCA Stealth over the E3 based on my recollection. I don't have one here to confirm, but I do think that the Stealth was possibly just a little bit better overall as a headphone, as it probably should be for the price. But at $2,000, both the Lyric 2 and the E3 are absolutely fantastic. Neither is perfect. They both have their own tonal issues. And that's where it's going to come down to you working out what is actually important to you. If you don't like too much bass in your headphone experience, if you enjoy focusing in on the mid-range and vocals and detail and texture, then that's where the E3 is going to be the better choice. On the other hand, if you're more focused on the emotional engagement, if you like a bit of bass, you like a bit of groove, then I think the Lyric 2 is the better choice, despite the fact that it's got slightly unbalanced treble. Now, of course, for those of you that are going to be EQing, that does get a little bit different. If you're going to be EQing, I'd probably go to the E3, I think the E3 with a little bit of mid-bass lift and maybe a slight pullback on the upper mid-range, if you're anything like me and that bothers you, I think that could actually be the perfect combination. The staging is still going to go to the Lyric 2 overall. It's got a little bit more depth to give, but I do get the sense, and I haven't really tested this to confirm it in any way, but I do get the sense that maybe the driver in the E3 has technical capabilities that are going to reward you more from EQing it than maybe the Lyric 2 will do. I sort of think of the Lyric 2 as an out-of-the-box, put it on and enjoy it headphone, whereas I think the E3 might suit those that want to tweak the sound a bit through EQ. As I said though, that's more of a gut feel instinct thing rather than a specific test that I've done with EQing to see which one I can get to what level. I'm not really a big EQ user if you haven't seen the channel before. I'm not against people using EQ, I just don't do it myself. And so as I said, where this leaves us is we've got two of the very best closed back headphones on the market, particularly at their price. And therefore for $2,000 US, I think the E3 is brilliant. And that then brings us to a talk about some of the other things that make the E3 really exceptional. If you haven't seen a Dan Clark audio headphone like this one before, some of the things that are great about these, and one of the biggest things that's great, is the way they fold up. You get this really tiny little package with that folding system, and that means it goes in this tiny little case. This is absolutely brilliant for those that need to travel with the headphone, commute with the headphone. You're not going to beat this in terms of size, performance, and price. Part of what also makes that possible is the fact that this has got a self-adjusting headband system. And so when you open it up like so, you put it on your head and the elastic there, or the spring, I'm not actually sure if they use elastic or spring, whatever they're using, it will just adjust so that your ears fit perfectly inside the pads. While we're talking about the pads and the ear cups and stuff like that, it is worth noting that these are a bigger cup than the Lyric 2, if that matters to you. I really like the Lyric 2 for its compactness. When I'm wearing it, it feels less cumbersome to wear from a size point of view. I think weight-wise, they're pretty similar. The E3 is maybe a touch lighter, but it also means that the opening on the inside of the pads is actually a bit larger on the E3. It's not a big difference, but it is a slightly larger opening if you have larger ears. Speaking of pads, for those that worry about this sort of thing, it's worth remembering that the Dan Clark audio earphones do not have quick replaceable pads. They are replaceable, but it's more of a process. It's a glued on or a double-sided adhesive type system. And so when it comes time to replace the pads, you do have to go through a little bit more of a process. I don't personally think it's a big deal, but it is something worth noting. If we then swing down to the bottom of the cups, we've got these Hyros, and I know I'm saying that wrong. It's actually Japanese brand, so therefore it's got a different pronunciation. But the Hyros connectors there, which are a multi-pin clip-on style system, they're very secure. I'm not necessarily a fan of them because no other brands use them. And so if you do happen to buy an aftermarket cable, you're really limited to only using it with Dan Clark audio headphones. But having said that, you shouldn't need to buy an aftermarket cable because the E3 comes with the very, very nice cable from Dan Clark Audio. It's quite a thick cable. It's maybe not quite as ideal for portable use in terms of size and length, but it's a lovely cable, particularly at a desktop type setup. It's a lovely cable. It's nice and thick, not too heavy, and it's got a nice fabric weave around the outside. And so in terms of cable, carry case, etc., that's all fantastic. The final thing to talk about is the aesthetics of the headphone. I personally am not a fan of the look of them. This is a very personal thing. It's not a reason not to buy these. If the Lyrics didn't exist, I would be looking at getting a pair of these for myself, I suspect. And in other words, I would happily put up with the aesthetics, but I personally am not a fan of a couple of things. I don't like the fact that it's a very flat plate here. For some reason, it doesn't look as nicely finished or sculpted, even compared to something like the lower level Aeon Noir headphones. I prefer the shape and sculpting of those over something like the E3. That's just personal, it's just me. The other thing I'm not particularly a fan of is the Gorilla Glass back. Not that it's Gorilla Glass, that's fine. My issue with it is I don't know why they decided to make it look like an open back when it's not. There's no need for it to look like an open back, and I think it almost cheapens the headphone by having a fake pattern on it. Again, that's just me. It's just my take on it. The final thing to note while we're talking about the cups is that these little holes here, in case you've noticed them, they're actually vents. And so the whole idea of this is it's going to help vent the pressure from inside the housing of the headphone driver, and that's going to allow for better bass performance according to the marketing. And indeed, I do think it works. The bass performance from these is exceptional. As I said before, I would like them to have more mid-bass, but the bass quality from these is excellent, and when faced with a bassy, deep, rumbling track, they absolutely deliver. both in terms of quantity and quality. They're very, very good. I just personally want even more quantity than they deliver. The key point though is there's no major roll-off, there's no lack of bass ability, and therefore if you do want to EQ a bit of extra mid-bass presence in there, they're going to respond really nicely to that. And so the final couple of things to mention before we move on, and there's a great video on HEADPHONE that talks about this, or even on the HEADPHONE YouTube channel that talks about this, is that inside these drivers, there's a couple of new technologies that I alluded to before. Firstly, Dan Clark Audio have continued the evolution of the AMTS system, and that means that they're better able to control internal resonances in the cup, direct the different frequencies of the sound coming off the driver to your ears, etc. As I said before, go and check out the HEADPHONE YouTube video if you want to know more and more about that. It's handled much better than I can because it's coming direct from Dan Clark himself. And then the other thing that's going on inside here that we can't see is that the driver's been further improved too. So for a while now, Dan Clark Audio drivers, the planar magnetic drivers, are not just a flat plane of plastic. What they're actually using is, or previously were using, was a corrugated system. The new version of that driver is using actually not a simple corrugation, but a complex set of corrugations. And that's designed to improve the way the driver responds to different frequencies, different excursion amounts, so how much the driver's moving. It keeps the driver nice and rigid, nice and strong, and therefore lowers distortion as far as I understand it. Again, there's a lot more detail, a lot more information on that HEADPHONE video, so check that one out. I'll try to remember to link it down below. Check that one out if you want to know more about those two technologies. But for now, I'm going to keep this focused on the sound and just say that I think the E3 sounds fantastic. As I said before, if the Lyric 2 didn't exist, the E3, in my opinion, would be my close-back headphone of choice. And the only reason it's not my close-back headphone of choice is because of a preferential lean towards the tuning of the Lyric 2. I honestly don't think that either headphone is better than the other. I think there are absolutely people out there that will prefer the sort of technically more neutral presentation that the E3 delivers. But there'll be just as many people, I imagine, that are like me and find the Lyric 2 to actually be more, I think, correct to how I expect to hear music played and hear it in a live situation. And therefore it all comes back to both preference and also how you hear, because we do all have slight variations in how we hear in terms of things like our perception of bass quantity, our sensitivities to upper mid-range and treble sounds. That's going to vary for all of us, and it's really important to take into account. And that's where I think we're actually blessed to have two amazingly capable and competent closed-back headphones. Neither is quite perfect. Both of them have some tonality trade-offs in my opinion, but both are incredibly good at the same time. And so if you've watched this video and you feel like the E3 is more to your liking than say the Lyric 2, I'll put a link down below through to Dan Clark Audio where you can read up more on it. If you're still on the fence and you haven't yet seen my Lyric 2 video, then also make sure to check out the review of that one where I did further comparisons of these two. For now though, I hope you found this video useful and interesting, and if you have, please hit the like button and subscribe and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.